The Green Bay Packers always have players of interest when it comes to fantasy football. Wide receivers often a conundrum, but we shall get to those soon. We will start, though, with our resident Green Bay Packers expert, Tom, looking at a quarterback who we hoped for high things for last season after an amazing 2023, and see if 2025 will be a bit rosier than it was last year, Tom.
Yeah, Jordan Love. So, I mean, what can we say? It wasn't all we wanted it to be, particularly as a Packers fan. But yeah, we'll go through and discuss them a little bit. So, obviously, we've got our initial stats, which I'm assuming we're going through to start off with. So, in terms of rank, currently ranked as the QB 14. He's got quite a late ADP of 122. So, he's going roughly in kind of around 10. And he finished last year as the QB 17, so not great. In terms of stats-wise consistency, finished as a top 6 QB just 11% of the time. He was a QB 1, so that's obviously ranked 1 to 12 for those who don't know, as 33% of the time. And then a QB 1 to 2, so that's 1 to 24, 66% of the time. So not phenomenal, but let's kind of dive in and look at it. Obviously, he was drafted in 2020 and he sat behind Rodgers for kind of 3 years. And, as you said, he had that impressive debut campaign. He threw for 4,159 yards, 32 touchdowns, and was able to add an extra 247 yards and 4 rushing touchdowns. That left him as the QB5 overall. And actually, Green Bay played an absolute masterstroke, getting him in and sitting in behind Rodgers. But there's no real way to sugarcoat it. Yes, last year was a bit of a disaster, and he certainly regressed. His stats took a bit of a nosedive. So he threw for just 3,389 yards and 25 touchdowns. Rushing was even lower. He added just 83 yards and that 1 rushing touchdown there. But I don't think the stats tell the whole story, and there's a little bit more kind of to dive into to discuss with him. So injuries were quite a big problem. He suffered an MCL strain week 1, which led to him missing 2 games. He picked up a groin injury week 8. And then problems with his elbow week 18. So this has clearly affected him. The Packers had to slot in Malik Willis, who actually, as a late pickup handcuff QB, not necessarily the worst option for you. And I think moving on from that, the coaching staff are really looking to protect him. But obviously that doesn't help us as fantasy managers. LaFleur seemed to switch that clear running game focus, which we'll come on to and discuss later when we talk about the running backs. But hopefully, an overall improvement in fitness this year should see him return to that low-end QB1, QB2 kind of range, that he originally looked slated for. New cat, who will probably interrupt us at least more than once. Issues with interceptions for him there. So 11 in both seasons. He's really got to take a step forward in terms of that to make him a truly fantasy viable option. And, as we said, the wide receiver room has been quite mixed. I don't think we've really replaced Adams in terms of that go-get-it wide receiver. There's no sort of clear number 1 target there, which, again, we'll come to later. There's still value for him, but he needs a good season this year, in my opinion. I don't know. What do you think, Mark?
I was surprised how bad's not the right word, because he still had his fantasy relevant games. And actually, you think about the injuries, think about the issues at wide receiver. He was all right. He certainly wasn't bad, but it feels like it wasn't. It feels like it was better than it was when you look back at the numbers. I think the shocking thing for me is from week 8 onwards, he was QB 30, which that is poor from our fantasy point of view. But we'll talk about the wide receivers. Say the fact that the Packers were the only NFL team without a single receiver with over 20% of targets shows just that existing. That chemistry clearly isn't there. Several players still there, a couple of new assets to him to use as well. It'll be interesting. I just feel that there's got to be a route to him being a QB1 again. You say he's going off the board at the minute. It's QB 14. I have him projected to be QB 13, so there or thereabouts. Not really any difference there. But when you're looking at that range of QB 10 to 15, you're there at the point where you're going to have to sit him certain weeks where it's not those friendly matchups. And I just felt like last year there wasn't really a rhyme nor reason to when the good games or the bad games were around the injuries, I guess, is what dictated that. I still think he could be a value raise, but I think actually he's going at a fair price and probably land about there, and then the season's all said and done as well.
Yeah, I mean, as a Packers fan, obviously, I'm hoping he takes a step forward. And, in terms of real football, that spread of the offense is probably quite useful. But for us as fantasy managers, we want one man. We want him throwing it every week to the same person. But unfortunately, at the moment, it doesn't look like it's working out that way. So you happy to move on and discuss running backs? Or
Yeah, so when we speak about that one man, there is someone who does seem to have a role to himself and able to utilise that, and that is Mr. Josh Jacobs.
Yes. So ranked as the running back 9 currently, ADP of 22. So he's going kind of late round 2, early round 3. And last year he finishes the RB6. He was an RB1, 44% of the time. An RB1 to 2, 77, really kind of 78% of the time if you round it up. And he only finished outside of RB3 5.6% of the time. So he had a great year. So again, let's delve in and sort of look at him. So he was our biggest success story last year. He slotted into that role that had been relinquished by Aaron Jones. And I would argue he's a different type of runner. He's much more physical than Jones. He's able to drag defenders with him and grab a few extra yards. He's no Saquon Barkley or Bijan Robinson, but he's perfectly capable of scoring you good fantasy points most weeks. And I think the coaching staff seem to, agree. They favoured him. Some of that could have been to do with them protecting Love, wanting to keep him safe and injury-free for the rest of the season. But he really was a focal point of the offense. At least 20 touches every game. Just a ton of opportunity in there to score you points, which was actually quite rare for LaFleur. Generally in Green Bay, his tenure, he's tended to have sort of a 1-2 punch combination with running backs. Even just going back recently to sort of Aaron Jones and AJ Dillon. So, it's nice to see them have that true RB1 for me as a fan anyway. PPR-wise, we said he finishes the RB6. He got 1,329 yards. He scored 15 touchdowns. So, not truly elite in the passing game, but he was able to add a little bit of extra spice on the top with 340 yards. Only 1 passing touchdown. But again, I do think that comes back to the inconsistency with Love, and the problems there at QB. He had a career high in touchdowns, and he was tied for the 5th most all season. Currently, he's going as the RB9 off the board. He's behind those elite names, but, he's still sort of in that mix. As we said, that late round 2, early round 3 ADP, and if you can get him as your RB1 because you've perhaps gone, running back in the first round. Sorry, cat's after me again. I think he's good value. And I also don't really think there's much else there to take the share away from him within Green Bay. We'll come on to the other running back who really has probably got a chance of doing that. But yeah, I think he's sort of a safe bet for the RB1, really.
Yeah, I think as you're saying there, where he's going towards the end of round 2, beginning of round 3, if you've taken one of the top wide receivers in round 1, if you're at the start of the draft, I think you're sat quite happy if you've got an elite wide receiver and Josh Jacobs is your RB1. That's a nice way to start your draft, really, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
And then looking back as well, last week from week 11 onward, you had 12 total touchdowns in those final 8 games. That is where that RB6, why I'm thinking more RB10 is I do think we're probably in for a little bit of touchdown regression, 16 total touchdowns. When you think he had the 5th most carries in the league, he was used so frequently inside the 10 and got 14 rushing touchdowns inside the 10 as well. It is repeatable, but I think the safe bet would be there'll be a little bit of regression there. So yeah, that's why I feel confident. But he's got the upside, and once again, you were about to mention the player behind him. I wouldn't be fearful of the competition if I was Josh Jacobs.
No, certainly not. I think the only real way any of the running backs come into play is if he takes an injury. It's the only way really they're likely to feature. I mean, we could have this totally wrong, but it just doesn't look like it. So the man behind him is Marshawn Lloyd. So difficult to talk about because it's such an injury hit last year. So we've got no real stats for him. He's currently ranked as the at 121, so quite high. Ownership's pretty low. He's only just 10% of leagues. And there was quite a lot of excitement around him when he came out as a rookie in 2024. But really, it's all just been an injury nightmare for the poor lad. Multiple lower body injuries. He's had appendicitis, an ankle injury, hamstring injuries. So he started just 1 game in week 1. Stats wise, 6 attempts, 15 yards, 1 target for 3 yards. So we can't really look at last year. There's very, very little to go on in terms of that. We can obviously look back at his rookie profile. So that was pretty interesting. 220 pounds, 5'9", 4.46 speed in the 40-yard dash. So he looks like he's got the tools to be a good NFL running back. It's just, can he sort of put it together? say, in terms of competition for the RB2 role, we've got Emmanuel Sanders there. You've got Chris Brooks there. I think he's a safe bet as your RB2, but I do feel if Jacobs was to go down, I don't think he'd be total lead back. I don't think they'd replace him as that RB1. I think you might have Sanders perhaps popping in on passing downs or something like that. So I wouldn't invest crazy in him, but I think, if you're talking a late best ball punt or, picking him up off the waiver wire if Jacobs gets injured. But yeah, my confidence isn't high for him being a huge fancy asset this season.
No, I completely agree. I think best ball of one of your very, very deep picks could be worth that gamble. And so I've got to watch the waiver wire because we've not seen anything, not enough, not seen anything really to base anything on deciding to draft him. Obviously, there is still the chance that there is some change. I do think the Packers are a team that would benefit potentially from bringing in another running back. We're recording this on the 23rd, just the 23rd, 2025. It's like 23rd of July. So if anything has changed since then, it's because we can't yet predict the future. Fantasy football would be a heck of a lot easier if we could. Yeah, hopefully we see more of Marshawn. I think he's the best we can say at this point.
Yeah,
Before we move on to wide receiver, then let's please take a moment to give us a subscribe, a like, and a share as well. We're profiling all 32 NFL teams through the offseason, so please go and check out one of the other 31 after you've finished listening to Tom and I talk about the Green Bay Packers. Wide receiver, that's a really easy area to decide for fantasy, isn't it? The Green Bay Packers wide receivers, never a conundrum whatsoever, always crystal clear who to play week in, week out. Do you want to start us off with Jayden Reed?
I love the photo, by the way. And I have to say, the new graphics, the video system, it's absolutely beautiful. It looks wonderful. So, yes, Mr. Jayden Reed. So, ranked 29 currently, ADP of 100. So, he's going kind of round 8. And he finished as the wide receiver 29 last year. In terms of consistency, it's all over the place. So, just a wide receiver 1, 16% of the time. Wide receiver 2, 22% of the time. And wide receiver 3, outside of wide receiver 3, 55% of the time. So it wasn't a particularly consistent year for him. Is he the wide receiver 1 in the side? He's shown some potential, but he didn't command passes in the way you'd really hope that wide receiver 1 would. As we said, he finished in the as wide receiver 29 this year. But the passing game wasn't great. We've already talked about Love's struggle. So does some of it come to that? He's on the smaller side in terms of wide receiver at 5'11", which makes me feel really small. And he's a little slow, for that smaller wide receiver size. 4.45 in the 40 when he came out. He's mainly featured out in the slot for the Packers. So, he's not that sort of go-get-em height jumping wide receiver. So I don't think that matters quite as much in terms of height. And he did see a pretty decent amount of volume there, as well as the ability to make big plays, but it was more of a handful over the season. As we said, he finishes those finishes as outside wide receiver 3, 55% of the year. It's worrying, and it doesn't necessarily fill you with tons of confidence. He needs to take a step forward to be truly, truly fantasy relevant. The team seem to like the spread, spread the play around. It's, as we've alluded to, it's difficult to predict who's going to be that main target. Great punt for me in best ball. Currently going as wide receiver 45 overall. So some sneaky value in those kind of formats. Potentially a good trade target in Dynasty. But I do think in terms of redraft, you've got to have some confidence in him if you're going to take him early. But, as an ADP, round 8 ADP, you could do a lot worse in terms of wide receivers.
As we often talk about, it's that route to potential fantasy value. If you're taking someone who could be their team's wide receiver 1 in round 8, there is a route to that being a value pick. It's the consistency was just a nightmare last year. So week 1, 33.1 fantasy points. Yeah, the breakout's on. Everyone's happy.
Yeah.
We then follow that up with a 6.6 and a 10.9. Week 4, it's all back again against Minnesota, 27.1 fantasy points. Those 2 games, week 1 and week 4, make up for over a third of his fantasy points that he scored over the whole season. That was the Jayden Reed experience last year. So, yeah, we're going to need to see consistency. Hopefully, we said the reasons for Love not being consistent as well. There is a route to it happening. I think my concern is the picture's got no clearer at wide receiver at all for Green Bay because they've gone out and drafted a round 1 wide receiver.
Yeah, who we're going to move on and talk about next. So Matthew Golden is our first round one wide receiver. A bit of a tongue twister for me, taken in a very long time. Yeah, current ADP of 101, so he's incredibly close to Reed. Where people are taking him again, round 8. Obviously, we don't have any stats because in terms of last year because he's a rookie. So for first and only pun of the day, he's got a golden opportunity to take over the wide receiver room. An impressive draft capital. He went 23rd overall in the first round. He's fast, 4.29 40-yard dash. And faster than the next best Packers wide receiver, Christian Watson, who we'll discuss slightly in a moment. Again, slightly undersized at 5'11". That's my height. I don't feel like that's undersized, but clearly for a wide receiver, it is. A good weight at 191 pounds. And the fact he's quite a lot heavy in those other speedsters. So if you're looking at similar sort of players in terms of size and speed, you're talking about Hollywood Brown, you're talking about Xavier Worthy. So he's got perhaps a bit more strength than those guys. College career-wise, strong finish, but overall, you'd say unimpressive. So he started at Houston Cougars in 2022 and just put up 584 yards and 7 touchdowns. And then 2023, just 404 yards and 6 touchdowns. So nothing to sort of write home about there. But then he transferred to the Texas Longhorns and he replaced the outgoing Xavier Worthy there. Much, much more impressive. 58 receptions, 978 yards and 9 touchdowns. So, an impressive end. Is he a player who's finally found his form and is ascending, or has he just had that flash in the pan one good season? For me, fancy outlook wise, he's got a strong potential to develop as a high-end wide receiver 2, potentially a low-end wide receiver 1. That good draft capital does give him plenty of time there to develop. The Packers have invested in him. They're going to have to, see what he can do. And apart from Reed, I would say he hasn't got masses of competition. And I don't feel they like to contest each other. For me, Golden's the speedster. He's going to be going long down the field, perhaps replacing Christian Watson, who's always injured. Whereas obviously Reed tends to play from the slot. The only issue, I suppose, if you're having those long runs and you're having to jump up and catch at the end, he's not massively tall. So he really needs to develop that alpha mentality to go up and get the ball. This year, is he going to end up a wide receiver 3? I think, again, he's a good option in best ball, a late round flyer in redraft. And I would perhaps look at him, trade for him in Dynasty and see how he develops. As I said, that 101 ADP, very, very similar to Reed. So it's not a particularly clear situation there.
No, it's not a clear situation. I think my biggest concern is the fact that before that 40 time at the combine, he was being spoken about as a decent wide receiver. I don't think he was being spoken about as round 1 talent in that situation, particularly. I was just looking through while you were talking there as well. He has, out of the wide receivers drafted, he is 12th when it comes to receiving yards in his final year at college. His production profile at college doesn't scream transferring into a high-end NFL wide receiver. But the Packers clearly see something in that, and they're clearly interested enough to go for that. So, for me, I think potential weekly flex play, because I would not start in week 1 if I drafted him. Not a chance. I think he's a player that could end up on the waivers probably by week 3 if people are panicking a bit. Maybe some value later in the season, but personally, he's a player I'm going to be steering away from fantasy. But I am interested to see if his production does go up, as you say, and is he just a 40 time, or is he going to be a bona fide wide receiver talent in the NFL?
Time will tell. So best of the rest in terms of wide receivers now. So obviously Romeo Doubs is still there. I think he's likely to be the wide receiver 3 in the offense, but I wouldn't value him highly in terms of fantasy. He's got a decent floor, but he has also seen quite a high snap share. So obviously with Golden coming in, there's potential that could be reduced quite a bit. He's just limited in terms of the wide receiver and the tight end route. We'll come on and discuss the tight end in a moment, but I can't see him, outscoring Reed, Golden, or Kraft. And obviously with the run-heavy offense last year, if that continues, I would potentially avoid him in redraft unless you take him very late. Again, late best ball, stash maybe, but not someone I'd be trading for and looking for in terms of dynasty. Coming towards the end of his contract, will he still be there sort of next year? Who knows? Obviously, we've got Christian Watson, who was slated as supposedly going to be the wide receiver one. He's just been injured consistently throughout his career, which is really limited what we've seen of him. You know, his stats are actually very good, 9.6 yards per target. You know, that's an elite stat line. But the problem is there's just not the volume there, you know, to warrant any kind of high pick for him. He's unlikely to be ready for the start of the season following that later-ish injury last year. You know, you could potentially grab him off the waiver wire and stick him on IR if your league will allow you to do that. But I wouldn't be rushing out to get him, you know, wait and see really how things pan out. And then finally, Dontayvion Wicks is the sort of last man up. You know, he's shown the odd flash in his 2 years there, but nothing really major. He's had that opportunity perhaps due to Watson's injuries and other players getting injured. So only really relevant in deeper leagues. And even then, I'd sort of temper your expectations with him.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm gonna wrap this bit up very quick. I am not drafting any of them. I'm not interested in any of them until I see something that changes my mind at this point. I think, yeah, for Reed, to say they're fancy irrelevant isn't fair because I'm certain Watson and Dobbs will have fancy relevant weeks. They will really help people at DFS, especially. I'm sure they will have weeks where they get into your best ball lineup if you draft them late. I wouldn't draft a player that I'd have no intention of ever starting. And I don't think unless we see anything different, I wouldn't intend on starting any of those unless my wide receiver core was wiped out by bye weeks.
So we move on to tight ends?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So obviously our last position to talk about, and actually perhaps one of the most interesting there is Tucker Kraft. So he's currently ranked as tight end 10. He's got an ADP of 119. So he's going around round 9. And he finished last year as the tight end 10. He was a tight end 1 to 6, 16% of the time. A tight end 1, 20, so that's 1 to 12 ranked, 27% of the time. And he was outside the top 25 tight ends just 27% of the time. So pretty good stats-wise, you know, in what is a difficult position. As you said, last year he finished the tight end 10 in PPR. Overall, it was a little bit hit and miss, but impressive stats when we look at efficiency there. You know, 50 receptions at 65 targets for 707 yards, 12 touchdowns, and he really came on strong towards the end of the season. It was in the second half. He's highly likely to remain as the Packers tight end 1. You know, initially, obviously, they drafted him and Musgrave looked good, but injuries sidelined him, and it's really been the Tucker Kraft show since then. My question is he perhaps the first passing option in the offense? You know, he's a big body guy. He's shown he can catch the ball. You know, we talk about his efficiency. You know, he's potentially undervalued for me. If Jordan Love can put it together and improve, he could be a real steal at that ADP. You know, he's currently going off the board as tight end 14. And he goes, let me ask you this, Mark. Yeah, he goes after Colston Loveland. So obviously, very impressive looking rookie, but still a rookie, hasn't played a game in the NFL. And just before Dalton Kincaid, who finishes the tight end 30 last year. So, you know, compared to those two, who would you rather have in your wide receiver?
Tucker Kraft, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got him down as tight end 9. In that range, I think there's only a small number of tight ends I would happily start every single week without thinking about it. And at the minute, that would be Bowers, McBride, Kittle, Hockenson, Laporta. Anyone else, I would consider sitting them in the matchup. And if you're landing tight end 9, it means you're probably going to have a handful of top 6, but you can have a few weeks where you are possibly fancy irrelevant as well. I think we've just seen Dalton Kincaid. I can't draft. I can't. We've not seen enough for me to want to do that. Colston Loveland could, by the end of the season, could absolutely have been the correct answer to that question, and not even close. But confidence-wise, at the minute, you've seen enough from Tucker Kraft to know you're probably going to be able to put him in your lineup most weeks. But you will need to have an insurance plan for those tight end tricky matchups, quite possibly. In fact, he averaged just under three receptions a game. It's a little bit touchdown or bust, I think, is the one thing, unless he sees that workload going up. If you're getting 3 receptions a game as tight end, that could very easily turn out to be 6.5 fantasy points potentially, couldn't it? Which isn't going to really help you either.
Yeah, and that wraps us up, right? Sorry, it's no clearer.
Well, yeah, no, not especially. But can you shed any light on your hopes and expectations for the Packers season in the real NFL outside of fantasy?
It does come down to Love making those improvements. Interesting, obviously, letting Alexander go to you guys in terms of defense. He hasn't really been, when he's been on the field, he's been elite for the Packers. But I do think bringing in McKinney was a bit of a masterstroke, and he's looked absolutely outstanding in terms of, DB positions. I hope they will do well, but I'm not overly confident, really, if I'm brutally honest. They're in a tough division. I do think we'll see some regression from the Lions, with Goff not playing in a dome every week, basically. But they'll probably get through the playoffs and then, as always, fizzle out.
Well, there we go. An optimistic outlook from Tom as we finish up the Packers show. As I said
I'm
earlier,
a Packers and Forest fan. Optimism is really in my makeup, yeah.
At this point now, then, please do go and check out one of the other 31 deep dive shows on all of the NFL teams as we profile each team through the offseason. And then stick around for the season as well. We have lots of exciting content coming for you. But for now, that is all from me. It's all from Tom. So as always, it's time for Malcolm to take us home.
You have been listening to Pestle and Ed of TH Fantasy Football. For more content, follow TH_fantasy_NFL on Instagram and Twitter.